Back again. This is Dave Spicer with my third in my series on the financial crisis, which is really a credit crisis that has become a financial crisis. In the last video, just to summarize, we found that Enron was kind of the trigger for all that's going on here because it started something called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which triggered something called FAS 157 and the SEC's rule to make sure banks use mark-to-market valuation for all of their mortgage-backed securities. And of course, the problem with that is it ratchets down the value of these thinly traded securities to ever lower depths without taking into account the component mortgages or the value of their collateral properties. Then we said, well, how big is the problem? And if you looked at all the total mortgages, it's about $12 trillion. But those that are in absolute trouble that need to be written down is basically 2%, and that amounts to about $240 billion, which is certainly a big problem, but certainly not the $12 trillion problem that we're heading towards because of the mark-to-market rules. So in this session, what I want to do is zero in on the bailout options. There's $700 billion has been authorized to be used to fix the problem, and the first pass approach was to have the Treasury purchase mortgage-backed securities from the troubled bank, essentially becoming customers of them, hoping that would raise the value of them. That hasn't worked, or it wasn't even started actually. We can explain why in a moment. And now the approach is for them to purchase equity in the banks, meaning they become owners of the banks. And what I think I can show here is that neither of these will work while this mark-to-market rule is still being applied to mortgage-backed securities. So let's go back to our model, and remember we had a situation here where we had written off, this guy had written off $4 billion for this one. He had written off $0.8 billion for that one. We had this guy who had written off, I think we said $3 billion for that one, and this guy had written off some as well. And of course, what it means here is this guy has, instead of having $4 billion equity, he has $1 billion. This guy is minus 4.8. Well, he only had $4 billion of equity anyway, so he's essentially going under. Now let's see what happens when the Treasury comes in and tries to purchase these mortgage-backed securities. Well, in this case, this one's worth about $1 billion, and if they were to buy for that, that would actually confirm to the Bank A that yes, in fact, it was worth $1 billion, and even if they know that over time it's actually worth more than that, this would confirm it, and by doing that, that would seal their fate. So the approach they've taken, or thought of taking, was to have what they call a reverse auction. And what that would do is they would say, okay, we have $700 billion to spend. Who wants to sell us their mortgage-backed securities for the least amount? And that's one way to determine a market price. Well, the problem with that is, let's say Bank A is desperately, of course, they need to do something, so they bid and want them to buy these for, let's say, $1.5 billion. Try to get something above the $1 billion. Well, if they do that, that's a signal to all these other banks that these people are in real trouble. The first people to line up for this reverse auction will be blackballed, really, and no one will want to make them any more loans in the future. They basically seal their own fate. So clearly that approach wasn't working, and so that led to the thought, well, let's purchase these. Let's actually purchase equity in the banks, okay, and become owners in the bank. So let's say the Treasury says, okay, we're going to use Bank B here because they're still above water here. They got $1 billion left in equity, and we're going to inject $5 billion into this bank. So here comes $5 billion in capital, and that means there's another $5 billion here in equity, which makes the total, if you add the other $1 billion, is $6 billion. So what the end result here is the government would now own 5/6 of the bank, and the people who had the original equity up here, the stockholders, would have 1/6 of their current, the value of their stock would be 1/6 in terms of the percentage of ownership. So now the problem with that is, again, these banks are going through this process of deleveraging, and they're holding on to their cash. So they want to loan the money out because they know these other banks are in trouble, right? So they would make loans to manufacturers over here and basically bypass these banks because these banks are in trouble. So A has definitely got a problem. B, because he got money, he's not in a problem yet. He wants to make sure he doesn't get back into the problem. And depending on what C does, if C gets some money, then he's okay. If he doesn't, well, he's not okay. So the net result is these banks will eventually go out of business because no one's going to make them any loans. The people with the money are going to go directly to manufacturers and other customers, non-banks, who they feel are qualified for the loans. And as a net result, the government's talking about doing this, in fact, has signed up 9 of the largest banks in the country to inject the capital. Well, you can imagine what's going to happen now. These 9 banks are going to essentially be owned by the government, and in fact, substantially owned by the government, probably up to this degree, 5, 6, or maybe even more, maybe even 90% of the bank would be owned by the government. So the question then becomes, if you have 9 banks all owned by the same party, is that really 9 banks or is that one new bank? Because basically what they would have done is create 9 branches, if you will, very large branches of the U.S. government bank now, and start directly loaning to manufacturers, bypassing these smaller banks who didn't get the funding. So it's interesting. Without solving the problem of still using the mark-to-market rules, neither one of these options actually works, unless, of course, you're one of the big banks, in which case the equity infusion is a good thing, unless you're an executive of that bank who used to own, let's say, 10% of the bank. He would now own 10/6 of the bank, less than 2% of the bank. So we have a big problem, and we're going to talk about a solution next. And in my next video, what I want to talk about is rolling back FAS 157, marking the mortgage-backed securities to what I call reality instead of marking them to market because they are illiquid, and then applying some real qualification rules to new mortgages. And I believe we could actually solve the problem. And of course, this wouldn't cost us a dime. I can see I'm running out of time here, so this will be it for this session, and I will see you at the next